Tonight I want to talk to you for a little while about some surprising sayings of Jesus. There are a number of reactions that we have recorded in the Bible about reactions that people had to things they heard Jesus say. Some things that he said that were astonishing. Sometimes it just put people on edge. I mean, there was an instance where Jesus said some very harsh things to the Pharisees, and then the disciples, they said, well, don't you know that you offended them? Jesus, we don't talk to the leaders like that. On another occasion, Jesus was talking about how difficult it was for the rich to be saved. And of course, the common thinking then, even as it is now, is that being rich was a symbol that God loved you, that God blessed you. And when Jesus says that it's hard for the rich to be saved, well, who can be saved, they ask. They're surprised by what he said. There are numbers of instances like that. But I don't want to look at all of these different reactions. There are some and some others that we could look to. But rather, I want to try to personalize this a little bit for us tonight in thinking about our understanding, our view toward the teaching of Jesus. Are we surprised by it? I doubt that we are. I doubt that we're surprised by the teaching of Jesus. Why would I say that? Well, if you're like me, and some of you are like me in this respect, you grew up hearing about Jesus. You've known about Jesus' teaching all of your life. And when you come across something that Jesus says, even when there might have been a strong reaction in the text that you read, you're not very surprised by it. You've heard it so many times, over and over again. And there's just not much about it that surprises you. And what that says of us is that, well, maybe we're familiar, but maybe we're a little too familiar with Jesus. Maybe we're a little too comfortable with his teaching. Usually when someone is surprised by something Jesus said, it has to do with what's going on in their life and how they perceive the implication of his message in their life. Makes them uncomfortable. Maybe they're insulted by it, put off by it. Maybe they're humbled by it and they recognize, well, there's much work that I need to do in my life because it sounds like he's talking right to me. So as we think about some surprising sayings of Jesus, does Jesus' teaching surprise you? Several weeks ago, a couple months ago maybe, I wrote an article about reactions to the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to notice a couple statements from the Sermon on the Mount tonight. But for a number of years, I have collected reactions to the Sermon on the Mount. Every once in a while, you'll come across people commenting about the Sermon on the Mount or even about Jesus' teaching generally. And I put several of these reactions. The latest, one of the latest ones that I came across was an article that I'd heard someone reference, and I went and digging and found it. Back in 1987, there was an English professor at Texas A&M who assigned the Sermon on the Mount to her class, and they had to write a reaction paper to it. And she was shocked at the reactions that she got from these college students. I mean, she said that, in 1987, that most of her students, they came from conservative families. They came from Christian homes, to use the expressions like that. And she was surprised at the reactions she got to the Sermon on the Mount. It was the first time these young people had actually read the sermon. Incidentally, when someone very dismissively says, "Oh, we don't need Christianity, or we don't need organized religion. We just, you just need Jesus. Just live by Jesus' teaching. Just live by the Sermon on the Mount." You know what that usually indicates? it usually indicates that person has never read a word of Jesus. Here's what I mean by that. Some of the reactions from these students. One student wrote, "I did not like the essay, Sermon on the Mount. It was hard to read and made me feel like I had to be perfect, and no one is." So evidently they recognize that, well, there is a moral and ethical bar that is established there. And they weren't very happy about that. Another reaction said, the things asked in this sermon are absurd. To look at a woman is adultery? That's the most extreme, stupid, unhuman statement that I have ever heard. Now, this professor, in writing an article about all of these reactions, she said one of the things that she at least appreciated about it is that how honest these reactions were. It's rare when you come across someone who's coming to terms with Jesus' message for the first time. She says that these students, they had virgin ears for this message, and they're just on it. This student didn't know that you shouldn't refer to Jesus' teaching as stupid, but he's just does. That's an honest reaction. Then lastly here, in this essay, the author explains the doctrines of an era in the past which cannot be brought into the future in the same context. This essay now cannot be taken the same way as it was written. It can be used as a guideline for good manners. Isn't that cute? The Sermon on the Mount can be used for good manners, Was Jesus trying to teach us to say please and thank you? No, that's what your parents are for, right, Deacon? Good manners. Good manners. At least this person was more respectful. But clearly that is not at all what Jesus was trying to do in that sermon or in anything else that he said. So I ask you again, does Jesus' teaching surprise you? And if it hasn't surprised you in a while, then you need to go back and you need to read some things that he said and start to ask your question, how does what he say affect me? What's he saying to me? What do I need to take out of his message and apply to my life? He should always make us uncomfortable because he attacks sin, he attacks selfishness. He challenges us time and again with the things that he says. So, some surprising sayings. We'll notice 3 here tonight, and the lesson will be yours. Going from one of the reactions that we just noticed, we'll start here with exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees. This is a surprising saying of Jesus. It comes from the Sermon on the Mount. He says in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, to put this into the context here, this is sort of after the introduction to the sermon. So Jesus has given the Beatitudes. He said some things that certainly are inviting, that would have perked up the ears of the people. Now when you get down to verse 20, he really starts getting people's attention. What is this business about exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? The Pharisees, of course, were the standard to which everyone else was upheld. They were known for their piety. They were known for their righteousness. They made a point to be known for their righteousness. How is it then? How is it that someone was to exceed their righteousness? You have to try to appreciate how the people would have been interested to know, well, what's he going to say next? What's he going to tell us next? How do we do this? Well, the rest of the 5th chapter really is instructions in how this is done, and he notices a number of examples of things that the Pharisees did and what they said and taught, and how one was to go beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees. The problem with the Pharisees was their righteousness, it was outward. It was this outward demonstration of piety. They wanted everyone to think that they were spiritually minded people. Jesus would rebuke them for they wanted to be seen of men. They wanted to have praise of men. They enforced very, very harsh rules upon the people, heavy burdens which they themselves did not bear. From their origin, the very early beginnings of this Jewish sect that emerges within Israel, they had very good intentions. The word Pharisee means separate. They were a separatist group, and they originally formed as a means to call the people back to a strict observance of the law of Moses. So they begin with very good intentions. The trouble is they obsess over form. They obsess over form and neglect motive. So Jesus would say, for example, in Matthew chapter 23, he rebukes the Pharisees extensively there. But he tells them, whatever they command you to do, do it. A lot of the instructions and commands that they gave were good to follow. A lot of them were in keeping with the law of Moses itself. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the motivation of the Pharisees. The problem was their heart. And what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, in explaining what he means by how we exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, is he brings to bear the equal importance of both method and motive. What you do and why you do it are equally important. So, eventually there's some who came to understand this surprising teaching of Jesus. The Apostle Paul struggled to understand who Jesus was and his purpose in coming, and eventually he does as a result of a confrontation. But it's an interesting passage I'm going to give you to connect to this. Jesus says we have to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, notice what Paul says. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I'm nothing. If I give all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. That was written by a Pharisee. That's what Paul was. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, as he would explain it. But in time, he came to understand what Jesus was saying. Yes, what we do is important. Keeping the law, the rules are important. But what's the purpose of keeping them? We do it out of love for God, out of love for our Savior, out of love for our fellow man. And until the motive is right, until our hearts are changed, we will fall short of this surprising saying of Jesus. Equally surprising, if we stay right there in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. We're to love our enemies. There in verses 43 and 44 of Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, there's a form to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus takes this, you have heard that it was said. He does that repeatedly to introduce a new idea. You have heard that it was said, and he cites what was said. When he does that, he's not quoting from the Old Testament. Some would say he's quoting from the Old Testament. That's not what he's doing. Whenever Jesus quoted from the Old Testament, he said things like, it is written, and he would say what was written. He's not quoting from the Old Testament. What he's doing is you have heard that it was said. He's saying, here's what people have said about this. Here's the opinions that people have given to this idea. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, you can search the Old Testament. You won't find that anywhere. But that was what was commonly accepted, viewed as permissible among Israel. Then Jesus says, but I say to you. Now that's surprising. But I say to you. The significance of that is he's commanding. He's not saying someone else said. He's saying I say. You know, the reaction to the Sermon on the Mount in the end of Matthew chapter 7 is the people were astonished because he spoke with somebody who had authority. When Jesus says, but I say, that's authority. And he had the boldness to claim it. So he says to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That continues to be surprising. Again, if you go to the reactions to some of the Texas A&M students, this was one reaction. I didn't have it in the PowerPoint. One person reacted to this statement and just said, well, the vast majority of people don't do this, so it cannot apply to our modern context. Our morality is determined by, consensus, is what most people think. And most people don't love their enemies. And that's true, most people don't. But Jesus' people are expected to love their enemies and to pray for those who persecute them. A very, very challenging saying of Jesus. We're supposed to make not just friends out of our enemies, but we're supposed to be trying to make family out of our enemies. And that's the purpose behind this teaching. Now you can go, you'd never be able to read everything on the screen if I would have put the last chunk of Matthew 5, which is all devoted to this idea of loving our enemies and in praying for those who persecute us. But what Jesus says is the reason why you do this is because this is how God is. God loves his enemies. Who are God's enemies? Well, over in Romans chapter 5 and verse 10, Paul says, for if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we're reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Paul describes sinners as enemies, God's enemies. So if you're a sinner, you're an enemy of God. That makes all of us God's enemy. Despite that, though, he did not obliterate us. Now, there were times where he could have done that. I mean, you go back to Genesis chapter 6 in the days of Noah, and he looked at Noah's generation, and he says, I regret having ever made man. That tells you about what was in God's heart when he looked down at the human family, his image bearers, whose minds were on evil continually, except Noah and his family, who sought to live a righteous life. So God spares Noah, but God was willing to spare more than just Noah and his family, wasn't he? God was willing to save everybody. God continues to want to save everybody. And he sent his Son here to make that possible. God loves his enemies. If you call God your Father, as we all do, then we have to learn. We have to learn to love our enemies. Not for the sake of just absorbing wrongdoing, but for the sake of making family out of our enemies. Loving your enemies is a surprising reaction, as most people don't do it. Someone who would seek to do us wrong or undermine us, try to make our lives difficult, if you're kind to them, that's surprising. They don't expect that. But that's just the very kind of thing that is needed to get somebody's attention. Not to demonstrate how wonderful you are, but to show them what they could receive from their Father if they'd change their heart, change their ways. Loving our enemies continues to be a surprising and deeply challenging saying of Jesus. But to do so is to emulate God, is to reflect His glory, is to properly bear His image. That's why we've been made. Then lastly, tonight we'll step away from the Sermon on the Mount and notice this statement in John chapter 8. Jesus says, I am. I am. Now, I had a choice when I was working on this point. I could have, done this little preacher trick where you make a point and then you make 7 points underneath it. I'm not going to do that tonight. So you can thank me when you walk out the door. There's a lot of I am statements of Jesus. That's not what we're going to do. In John chapter 8 and verse 58, now Jesus is arguing, debating the Pharisees. And as this debate, it becomes increasingly tense. And the people there, they declare, well, we're the children of Abraham. They didn't need Jesus. They were the children of Abraham. Jesus says to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, why is that a surprising statement? If you read the next verse, you know how they reacted in the next verse? They tried to stone him to death. Because Jesus did something here that to the ears of a Jew was unthinkable. He said something that people don't say. I am. Who said that before? You remember the burning bush. Moses going to see why this bush was on fire but not being consumed, and there was a voice that came out of the bush. It was the voice of God. It was the voice of the Creator. And he gives instructions to Moses, and Moses asks the question, well, what should I tell the people your name is? And he says, I am that I am. It is an expression of the eternity of our Creator. And on this occasion, Jesus claimed that for himself. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why Jesus' teaching is surprising. This is why it is challenging. This is why it cuts us. This is why his teaching must be heeded. Jesus is God. And as we're embarking on the Christmas season where people are commemorating the birth of Jesus, singing songs of his birth, all of those songs emphasize he is God, his divinity. It is unfortunate, though, those songs, much like his message today, doesn't seem to resonate with people. If he is God, then I can't just ignore him. I can't just dismiss his teaching. I can't just say, well, the majority of people don't live like that, so it can't apply. I can't brazenly characterize it as unhuman and absurd and just go on my way. The divinity of Jesus is what makes his teaching powerful and of force in our lives and in our world. So while an audience like this may be well acquainted with the teaching of Jesus, never stop being surprised by it. When we are not surprised by it, when it doesn't faze us, that is an indication that our hearts have grown cold and indifferent. And if that has happened, well, we need to wake up. Jesus' teaching is surprising. It's challenging, it's difficult, but it is possible that we meet the challenge of his message. He didn't come here to just overwhelm us or to establish a goal that is unattainable, unreachable. It is very reachable. It's within our grasp because he helps us. He helps us. He guides us and directs us. He recognizes the potential that we have because we've been made by His Father. He sees us not as what we are, but for what we can become. And His grace is sufficient to transform us and enable us and empower us to become all that we need to be in this life in hope of being united with Him in eternity. I appreciate your attention tonight. If there's someone here tonight who'd like to respond to the teaching of Jesus, you have an opportunity to do that. If your life is not right with Him and you want to seek restoration, that could start for you tonight. If we can help you be saved, please come forward and make your request known as together we stand and sing.